big thing that happened in the teens was World War I. And in Europe, that was devastating, and it more or less shut down the film industry at large. But it did enable the American film industry to take off, which created more of a demand for short subjects. And so animation really thrived during the World War I period.
Certainly there had been animated stars in the teens, people like the utterly unfunny Colonel He's a Liar that John Bray produced, or the Tom Sawyer-ish type of character, Bobby Bumps, that Earl Hurd animated. But these didn't have a huge following.
The competition for cartoons really was the two real comedies like those by Chaplin and Keaton and Lloyd and people like that. They dominated the theater programs in the 20s to a much greater extent than cartoons did. The cartoons had a certain novelty, fad period in the late teens, but when they became a more familiar part of the program, they also became a less attractive part of the program because most of them weren't any good.
The Fleischers created Koko the Clown, which had a sort of basic, mischievous type of personality.
Koko came out of the pen of Max Fleischer as he was drawing him, and then would leap or hop off the drawing board and create mischief. That was the beauty of it, was that first off, it made Koko a truly animated character.
What Max did with the rotoscope was to film live action.
The rotoscope allowed for lifelike movement. In fact, it was just tracing of live action footage of humans. So it was realistic, it reminded you of life, and yet it was an animated figure, and so it really stunned an audience.
Despite the great popularity and the enormous fluidity that the rotoscope allowed them, the Fleischers quickly wanted to go one better. You can see that in The Clown's Little Brother, which is 1920, where already there's a face-off between the clown being rotoscoped, of course, and his little brother, who is not rotoscoped. And the clown does some wonderful kinds of tricks and then says, see? And his brother then does him one or two or three better because he doesn't tire and he doesn't have to obey gravity.
Little brother can, metamorphosize, can do all this wild and crazy stuff, whereas Koko is stuck being a guy in a clown suit. That's such an amazing example of the limitations of rotoscoping versus just being able to animate out of your head. Rotoscoping had obviously got them to that point where they can create some kind of a believable character, but to get it to the next level, they had to leave the rotoscope behind.
And then animator Dick Huemer came on, who was a magnificent animator.
Their principal animator, Dick Huemer, was one of the first guys to really crack the code and figure out how to make the break with rotoscoping.
Dick Huemer was the absolute master of the thick line animated drawing type of character. It separated the characters from the background. It gave them a kind of snap and pizzazz and presence. Huemer had an incredibly vigorous and fluid and cartoony style of animation that other people at the studio who came in while Huemer was there, people like Ted Sears and Grim Natwick, started to use in their own animation.
And the idea that Max would play himself in these films was also pretty cute. There was no actor there. That was really Max Fleischer. And I think that's very endearing.
The drama takes place in an artist studio, which is not a subject matter that most American movie public can relate to, but apparently it worked. People understood how drawings happen.
Out of the Inkwell cartoons follow in the tradition of the Bobby Bumps cartoons in that we see the hand of the animator intervening, interacting, causing disruptions for the lives of his characters. But what I really find moving and interesting is how frequently Koko rebels against the animator. Max draws a spider, which wraps up Koko in a web and takes him home to feed him to his family for supper. Koko escapes and finds a way to get his revenge and trap Max in a giant web himself.
Films would always end with Koko the Clown returning to the inkwell, and hopefully order, reestablishing itself.
In one cartoon, Max is in a real live-action car, and suddenly that turns into a huge inkwell. And he as a cartoon Max, shoots down Coco, who's flying over the city in a balloon, and they all go down into the inkwell together. It's very interesting in that the Fleischer cartoons are ones that don't end at the frame line, that you can very easily go from the drawing to the studio to the world outside. And you can just as easily go from the world outside to the studio into the cartoon. It's an infinitely mutable universe where things are folded into one another. Coco cartoons are very much about parallel universes.
What happens in between those two different universes is, what happens in one affects the other in the films. This constant give and take. And it's very exciting. I don't know how they thought of that.
It'd be lovely to be a fly on the wall back in 1926 and hearing the two brothers talk about how they were going to make a particular cartoon. Some of them are so unusual. The ideas behind them are so striking and surprising and so unlike what else was being done then.
I think the Inkwell series is underrated because it hasn't been easy to view them. But the more you see them, the more impressed you are.
They were experimental in many ways, and there were techniques which were later used by people like Norman McLaren up at the National Film Board of Canada of animating human beings.
Often even the live action footage is manipulated.
For instance, in Trip to Mars, Max wants to send Coco off to the moon.
But you see this scene of Max when he's blown up, and I guess it's probably shot him lying on his back and on a black thing, and he's going like this and this, and they're blowing smoke over him, and it works.
They very often animated Max as photographs. They would take individual photographs of him and animate them, exactly as you animate individual drawings. For instance, when he's running along the rings of Saturn with Coco, they're both animated, but in different mediums.
Max Fleischer invented something called the rotograph, which allowed the efficient combination of live action and animation.
And the fact that they were able to achieve some of their more inventive ideas without computers, without special effects departments, without spending very much money at all, they show real imagination, both in the storytelling and in the way they devise and carry out their ideas.
The Fleischers used a lot of different forms of animation. They used cutouts, they used puzzles, and they even used claymation in a film like Modeling.
Again, it was the first meeting of the mediums, with the clay thrown at the figure drawn on paper, and vice versa, where they're doing the caricature of the guy, and it's great because they got like one of the ugliest actors in the world. And then Coco satirizes the whole thing, gets inside the clay and makes the clay wiggle around.
And at one point, Coco starts moving its rather large nose and then jumps off and inchworms his way across the carpet, much to the consternation of everybody watching.
Another thing that happened was the introduction of assembly line techniques. And there's controversy as to who or which studio introduced this.
The Fleischers had a very ambivalent attitude toward mechanization and the process of mass production. For instance, Cartoon Factory, it starts out as a sort of wish fulfillment. Max builds a machine that draws the backgrounds, draws house, goes inside the house, draws all the furniture.
The Cartoon Factory, that's just so radical. That little sort of machine he rides around on, redrawing the scenery around him, it's just so brilliant.
But in the same cartoon, there's a stamp machine that is turning out live-action, photographic cutout Maxes, and they're all exactly the same. And that is a more frightening-looking thing. They see mechanization and mass production as, on the one hand, time-saving, and on the other hand, they see it as something that can become rigid and overly controlled.
I don't know how they did it, but it just seems like each film was really a different direction.
It seems like the Out of the Inkwell films, more than other cartoons of the 20s, are constantly commenting on the form, which is what we think of as a trait of postmodernism, when something sort of draws attention to itself and the form in which it's created. And the Inkwell films never get away from that.
That's what really set me off onto my own path. When people ask me, what animator influenced you, I would say, well, there were the Fleischers. They took the original impulse that came from the performance artists, the lightning sketch people, and they took that impulse and built it into something quite grand.
What Coco's films really revolved about was this kind of rivalry, one-upmanship between Coco and his boss. But it wasn't really a personality-driven series. Now, what happened was it became manifestly clear that personality-driven series were where the money was. Probably the first true animated star was Otto Messmer's Felix the Cat.
Felix the Cat was the most important silent film series, and it was typically referred to as Pat Sullivan's Felix the Cat, but in fact, Sullivan was a promoter, and the person who really did the animation on Felix, and who also drew the Felix the Cat comic strip, was Otto Messmer, who was a quiet person, kind of shy.
It's all common knowledge that Otto Messmer was the true genius behind the success of it.
It's an artist completely investing himself with the character and identifying with the character and hoping that the audience will identify with the character as well, in which they did. It was an enormously popular character. The animation in the Felix cartoons is personality driven. That's what really moves the cartoons. The backgrounds could be as simple as a line and maybe a patch of grass here or there to indicate an outdoor setting if that's where it needed to be set, or if an indoor one, another line up the side to kind of indicate a wall.
Felix cartoons, I think what distinguishes them is that they're very down to earth.
If I was on a desert island and I had nothing else, if I had Felix the Cat films, that would be it, because that's the most basic thing. It's the simplest thing and the most direct, and it says animation. It's not trying to be anything else. It's not trying to be live action. It's not trying to imitate anything. It's what it is.
There were two different Felixes. The older Felix was more of an instigator, troublemaker, etc. He was a union organizer.
Felix Revolts. It's this politically charged cartoon, and it's neat to see the dawn of the labor movement and unions and the New Deal that was to come, with the Depression, and how those become subjects of a cartoon.
In Felix Revolts, you get a sense of how difficult it was to form unions at the time, what extremes they had to go in allowing the rats to completely take over the town, as in the Pied Piper. But here that you have a contract, you have negotiations, you have meetings, and he doesn't do it by himself. He calls on all of the cats to join. Felix Turns the Tide is a very strange and funny but incredibly odd sort of retelling of the horrors of trench warfare between, in this case, cats and mice. And the battlefield is littered with corpses of cats or corpses of mice.
Felix turns the tide of the war by enlisting hot dogs, which are conscripted from a butcher's shop and sent to the front lines to aid Felix. In fact, hot dogs have a frequent recurrence in silent animated cartoons. They pop up a lot in early animation, but it is a very inspired choice to send hot dogs to the front line to chase back the rats, because in my world, rats aren't afraid of hot dogs. They devour them pretty easily.
It's a very strange cartoon, and yet at the same time you feel very much that it is a cartoon made after World War I and partakes of that feeling of disillusionment.
Messmer's early Felix was a very angular character.
Felix originally was boxy like a dog.
As the series became more successful, other animators were brought in.
Messmer started bringing in, quotes, guest animators, and one of them was Bill Nolan.
And what Nolan did was he changed the design of Felix to make him easier to animate. So Felix had a very pointy snout, became shorter and rounder. So Felix's face turned from something that was more or less triangular to something that was round. And his body became round. Otto Messmer described it as being his head was a nickel and his body was a dime.
Again, there's the assembly line creeping in. If everybody has to draw this character the same way, circles are faster.
Felix is this totally abstract figure, and of course he could be farmed out to in-betweeners because anyone can follow this abstract creation. They're just rectangles and spheres and triangles for the ears.
Something like Felix was very important because not only was it easy to do, but they developed a personality for him, and people recognized that.
He was a thinking character. He thought before he acted. And so those films are not just, run, chase. They're run, stop, think, solution, run. So there's a staccato quality to the timing of those films that's quite different from the others. Felix in Hollywood is a great film because Felix meets the person he was modeled after in many ways, Charlie Chaplin. Otto Mesmer studied Chaplin, studied his films, and studied also stills. So a lot of that pantomimic quality and that looking at the audience and making real communication comes from that. He meets Charlie Chaplin, and Chaplin makes a reference, "You're the guy that's been stealing my stuff."
There is certainly a cross-fertilization between slapstick comedy and early animation. I would say the most influential character on early animation was probably Buster Keaton. There certainly was Chaplin influence, but Keaton is the silent film clown that we most identify with creating the gag, and not just the gag as a pratfall, but something that develops gradually with its own interior logic. And this happens when animators are looking for ways to expand their own films beyond just the gag. For example, Walter Lantz did this.
Walter Lantz worked both in live action and animation.
Lantz reminded me of Harold Lloyd, the glasses. He reminded me of that type of silent comedian in a way, and I think he probably had another career going if he wanted to leave animation. He was good.
Walter Lantz worked at Bray, where he created Dinky Doodle before he went on to create characters such as Andy Panda and Woody Woodpecker.
The Dinky Doodle cartoons were fantastic cartoons. I mean, I don't think I've seen a bad one. Every one was funny and creative and inventive, and they used the same trick as the Fleischers in that they'd have still photo backgrounds and they'd combine animation with live action. But it just was really creative, and in a way, I think it's probably some of the best stuff that Lantz had ever done, even after he started doing sound.
Walter Lantz, I think, has gotten a bad rap from history. Lantz was an extremely talented animator and a very inventive character who had the misfortune of coming in to take over characters that other people had created. At the Bray studio, Walter Lantz was brought in to fill Max Fleischer's shoes. Max had just left the Bray studio with his Out of the Inkwell cartoons that featured the cartoonist in conflict with the character that he had drawn. And Walter Lantz was told to do the same thing. So as a result, Lantz's Dinky Doodles films are seen as Max Fleischer wannabe movies. And I think this is unfair. The films, which are not easy to see, are inventive, they're wonderfully animated, but the fact that these are seen as derivative, that Dinky Doodles is a spin-off of Coco, has gone very much against him. But during this period, the Bray Studios were really a spawning ground for almost the entire American animation industry. A number of Disney's top people began at Bray. A number of people who went on to found the Van Buren Studio, which was an early major studio, began at Bray.
Paul Terry worked for Bray for a short time, but his primary contributions to animation were the Aesop's Fables series and the Farmer Alfalfa cartoons.
At the Paul Terry studio in the 20s, they were turning out a cartoon every week with a very small staff, and one reason they could do that was because Frank Moser could draw so rapidly. Now, Frank Moser's animation looks nothing like Winsor McCay's. You're not seeing any sort of drawing skill there. But at that point in animation's history, that facility, that great speed, was valued as much as true craftsmanship.
Early on, Walt Disney was really aware with what was going on in New York with the studios. He admired the work of Paul Terry, and I think Disney emulated the East Coast style as best he could.
Well, Disney at the beginning really knew exactly what he wanted. For instance, 3 of his early films are fairy tales, Red Riding Hood, Four Musicians of Bremen, and Puss in Boots. But even though he knew exactly what he wanted, he didn't know how to get it. So he was very careful about putting in all the details and rendering it and making it very polished and finished looking, but it was dead as a doornail.
The Alice in Cartoonland series were a reversal of the Out of the Inkwell series.
She is matted into the films, and it was clear that Disney was trying to emulate the success of Out of the Inkwell.
But the Oswalds were completely different. He had a wonderful staff at that point. He had Iwerks, who was the genius behind all the movement in the early Disney films. He also had Hugh Harman and Rudy Ising, who would soon go off on their Bosco run. And he also had First Feeling, as a matter of fact. They're experimenting with perspectives. The gags are fast and funny and well-timed and well-paced, and the whole thing moves.
Disney wasn't the first to use sound. In fact, I think the Fleischers have that to their credit because they experimented with Dr. Lee DeForest, who was making his phonofilms in the mid-1920s.
DeForest had a system called the DeForest Phonofilm, and this was a system that recorded sound onto the soundtrack on the film as opposed to a kind of phonograph record. And there were a series of films made by the Fleischers that used the phonofilm process.
Max Fleischer had the inspiration to create 35mm films with a bouncing ball that would follow the lyrics of the song and let the audiences sing along. Disney would employ it to great effect in Steamboat Willie, but in fact, Fleischer himself made a synchronous sound cartoon 4 years before.
The films even use some limited dialogue in at least one film that anticipates what Disney is doing later.
I know that Steamboat Willie was not the first sound cartoon per se, but it was the first one to really be innovative about the use of sound.
Disney's innovation was the idea that the cartoon world could be a totally self-enclosed space and that people would believe it.
There were other experimentations with sound around the same time. There was Bosco that harmonizing and Freeling made for Warner's, where they animated to the sounds of the piano and the sounds of Bosco talking and singing. And it really did create a very different tension in the animation. I think it's very effective, and of course it would be the way that animation would go from there on, to pre-record the track.
Finding His Voice is a film made by the Fleischer Studio to demonstrate the new Western Electric sound system. And it uses 2 strips of film. One is named Muty, who represents the silent era, and one named Talkie, who, of course, does most of the demonstrating in the film and explaining of the process of how sound is recorded through this Western Electric system and then brought to an audience.
The transition to sound, once it got rolling, was very rapid.
Take it from me, you'll never land a job the way you are.
And these small animation shops that couldn't make the transition typically just disappeared.
It's just amazing what was going on then, and Disney just constantly upped the ante, as they say, just constantly improved techniques of recording, of narrative, of draftsmanship, of design.
The main thing about Disney was he began to use pencil tests, where they would shoot the pencil drawings before coloring them to see if it worked. And if it didn't, they could still correct it. And that was a major breakthrough.
Carl Stalling, who was his musical director for a short while at the beginning, came up with the idea of a separate series of films.
Silly Symphonies, which Stalling proposed, the music would come first and then they would sort of work the action around that.
He revolutionized film music.
The fact that all the cartoon studios had these series that were using the musical conceit, like Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies and Happy Harmonies and Color Rhapsodies. I mean, even that all comes pretty strictly directly from Disney.
Pardon me. I've always wondered how they were made.
There's a wonderful film from the Van Buren studio called In a Cartoon Studio, where you see cartoonists, who are all funny animals, of course, animating to music played in the studio. And it was a sort of giddiness almost that you feel in a lot of these early sound cartoons.
It gave animation an impetus it didn't have before. The fact that you could make a moving drawing talk or sing or dance, extend the reality part of it, it just gave people a very strong reason to be able to believe in characters.
What sound brought was the sort of three-dimensionality to the characters.
Right.
That allowed them to fill in the void left by the absence of the great silent comedians like Lloyd or Chaplin or Keaton. Increasingly, the cartoons would take over the comic function of the old two-reelers.
In the 1930s, the Fleischers became the most important studio again because by the mid-1930s, Popeye had really edged out Mickey Mouse as the most valuable cartoon franchise. Popeye always has an edge, and he's always memorable, as long as the Fleischers are in control.
It took Warner's a little time to catch up too, because they didn't hit their stride till the mid-30s, when the great artists like Tex Avery and Chuck Jones and Bob Clampett joined Friz Freleng and started making the Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies that we all remember, with the characters that we all love so much. But so much of what I see in animation